This is Garis book readings of my two published paper books, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. This is chapter 7, entitled Forces Opposing Globa, taken from my second book, Multis and Monos, what the multicultured can teach the monocultured towards the creation of a global state. Chapter 7. Forces Opposing Globa. Subtopic headings: A. Introduction. B. Globaloni? C. Nationalism. D. National sovereignty. E. Cultural differences. F. The clash of ideologies. G. Religious differences. H. Charity begins at home. I. Cultural inertia. J. Cultural alienation. K. Anarchist opposition. A. Introduction. Know your enemy. This chapter is in a sense the opposite of chapter 5, which was devoted to the forces pushing towards the creation of a global state. This chapter deals with those forces that are opposed to the creation of a global state, to those forces that will slow down or even actively oppose the creation of a global state. If this book is to be persuasive in its aim of motivating people to push for the creation of a global state, then it needs to be realistic relative to those forces opposed to such a motivation. If these opposing forces are not addressed, and if possible antidotes are not found against them, then it will be all too easy to dismiss the suggestions of the earlier chapters that it would be a good thing to form a global state, and in particular that doing so will be practical this century. Hence, in the sections that follow, after each opposing force is introduced and discussed, this is followed by suggested remedies to overcome that opposing force. The main aim of this chapter, therefore, is to overcome doubts on the part of readers who think that the idea of creating a global state is premature and unrealistic, due to the many powerful opposing forces discussed below. By countering the strengths of these counter-arguments with even stronger counter-arguments, then perhaps readers will become more committed globists, and then help with the establishment of a global state and the promotion of a globist agenda, the two topics discussed in chapters 8 and 9. B. Globaloni? To many people in many countries, the very idea of creating a global state sounds like a pipe dream, a fantasy, as unrealistic as their chances of having a vacation on the moon within the next 10 years. This attitude is expressed in the term globaloni, that is, global baloney, that is, nonsense. Why do so many people feel so strongly against the idea of a global state that they dismiss it with such a pejorative term? This section's main purpose is to acknowledge the size of the problem of creating a world state. It will not be easy. The magnitude of the hurdles to be overcome are formidable. For example, problems such as the psychological forces of nationalism, the unwillingness of national leaders to reduce their national sovereignty, the depths of cultural differences, the clash of ideologies, the frictions due to religious differences, the argument that charity begins at home, cultural inertia, cultural alienation, the opposition of the anarchists, etc. Each of these problems will be raised, discussed, and possible antidotes found to overcome them. We begin with probably the biggest, that is, the power of nationalism. C. Nationalism. Nationalism is a powerful force. Look at how the populations of Europe reacted when World War I broke out. There was almost jubilation, euphoria. It was an intensely emotional event. It's a typical reaction, for example, when multis confront monos with the inferiorities of the monos' cultures as seen through the cold eyes of the multis, for the monos to feel angry and hurt. When the multis attack the inferiorities of the monos' cultures, the monos feel as though the multis are attacking them personally. Why? because the monos identify themselves with their cultures. They are members of their cultures. So if they identify themselves as Xians, where X is some country or culture, then when X is criticized by the multis, the Xians feel slighted. It will not be easy getting the Xians and Yians to merge politically to form a global state. They will have cultural differences, religious differences, ideological differences, linguistic differences, etc. With so many differences, how will it be possible to get the two sides to lower their distrust of each other to the point that a political merge is possible? Question mark. If a mini Globa, that is a partially formed Globa, is already established, it will not be wise for it to push the remaining non-member states too hard to join it. If it does, then very probably nationalistic forces within those non-member countries will surface to resist the merge. The more the mini Globa pushes, the more the remaining countries may resist. To the Xians, mini Globa is alien, foreign, them, not us. On a small scale, the same kind of phenomenon exists when a multi complains to a mono about some inferiority of the mono's culture. As is discussed from different angles several times in this book, we are faced once again with the classic multi-mono confrontation. That is, from the mono's perspective, all he sees is the multi complaining about his culture. This can be extremely annoying to the mono, who will probably react with a statement such as, "Well, if you hate this place so much, why don't you go back to where you came from?" To the mono, all he sees is a complaining multi. He may not even know the complainer is a multi. The mono does not understand what the multi is saying because the basis of comparison used by the multi, that is, having lived in at least one other culture so as to be able to compare at least two cultures, lies outside the life experience of the mono. From the perspective of the multi, the intercultural ignorance of the mono is frustrating because no matter how clearly the multi explains the differences, that is, the superiorities of the other cultures, used by the multi to convince the mono will remain unmoved. The mono simply cannot identify with what the multi is talking about. To the mono, the multi may as well be talking about the far side of the moon. It's this incomprehension of monos that multis find so frustrating, and as is stated often in this book, is the main reason why multis prefer the company of other multis. At least when two multis come together and multi-1 complains about some aspect of multi-2's initial culture, then multi-2 is much more likely to be open to the criticism than would a mono, because the multi-2 has already lived through the same kind of multicultured experiences as has multi-1. That is, he has lived in at least two cultures and can thus compare the two or more cultures he has lived in. When multi-1 complains about some custom of multi-2's first culture, then multi-2 can think, instead of reacting negatively, that, quote, "When I moved from my first culture to my second, I became very conscious of various superiorities of my second culture. So I can sympathize with what multi-1 is saying to me, even though I have not lived in the cultures he is using to compare my first culture with. I understand that multi-1 is doing what I did when I was in my second culture. That is, I compared and complained about the inferior aspects of my two cultures. I know how he feels, because I felt the same way about my set of cultures. We understand each other that way. We are both multis." Multis find the intercultural ignorance and incomprehension of monos boring, limited, hick, and tend to look down on monos. Monos find the complaints of the multis insulting and threatening. It's therefore not surprising that multis and monos tend not to get on very well and choose not to spend much time in each other's company. Now scale up this problem by a factor of millions, that is, between the populations of two nation-states, and imagine that the first one is much further along in the cultural homogenization process than the other, so that the first culture contains millions of multis and the second culture contains millions of monos. Probably the major difference between these two cultures is that the first one is much richer, has a much greater access to the global media, and a high proportion of its citizens speak the world language and has travelled extensively. The second culture, we can imagine, is poor, undemocratic. Its citizens have not travelled much, for example, as in China. They don't speak the world language, and few of them have the global media because their government bans access to it, for example, as in China. China, the shithole. How would these two cultures interact? If the multiculture put pressure on the monoculture to multiply itself, the monoculture would appeal to the monoculture's nationalism. The annoyance and insulted feelings of millions of citizens of the monoculture could be tapped into and used as collective resistance to the pressure of the multi-culture. The globists in the multiculture, or even a mini-globa, need to be careful as to how they promote their globist goals and dreams. Obviously, if the globists want to achieve their goals, they will, by the nature of the task, need to persuade the monocultured nations to think globist and become conscious of the advantages of living in a global state. But they cannot push too hard, otherwise they will generate a nationalist backlash that will simply slow up the merging process. Different countries will join the mini-globa at different times. Those already joined will be speaking more or less the global language, will have a global media, will be travelling frequently to each other's countries and generally benefiting from the mutual superiorities of each of their cultures. Those cultures not merging, especially the poor dictatorships, if there are any left by the time mini-globa is forming, will fall further and further behind the level of development of the mini-globa. In time, the leaders of the poor dictatorships will see that they are falling behind and may feel ashamed. They and others of the poor dictatorships may then be more motivated to become democratic and to multiply. Remedies. So what suggestions can be made by the globers to overcome the powerful problem of nationalism? The suggested remedies will be much the same for all of the problems listed and discussed below, namely the need to strengthen those forces that push the creation of a global state, that is, those discussed in Chapter 5, particularly the increase in the speed of the Internet, the growth of a global media, the Glow Media project, the growth of a global language, the free exchange of ideas, etc. Nationalism is a powerful force. I have lived in 7 countries and have seen monos from each country expressing powerful emotions about their own cultures. I have seen Vive la France, Deutschland über alles, Britain rules the waves, USA, USA, Nippon Nichiban, Jungguo Jayo, etc. I have lived for many years in Belgium, in the city of Brussels, the capital of the EU, which is one of the least nationalistic countries on the planet, due to it being a federation of 2 mentalities, that is, the French-speaking Walloons and the Dutch-speaking Flemings, who don't like each other very much, though there's not much in the way of Belgian nationalist sentiment, except when its soccer team starts winning its way towards the final of the World Cup. Of the European countries' mentalities I'm familiar with, I'd claim that the French and the British are the most nationalistic. The Brits because they live on an island and were top dog in the 19th century, and the French because Paris is far from its international borders, and because France was the dominant nation for centuries in Europe. Both countries warrant a certain pride in their achievements, so a certain level of nationalism on their part is understandable, even if I think it's becoming outmoded to be nationalistic. By far the most nationalistic country of the 7 I have lived in was the US. I really think now it's more Chinese. I mean, the Chinese government just pumps Chinese nationalism to the Chinese people because it has monopoly control of the media. So the Chinese get Chinese nationalism every day, and it's unconscious. You start criticizing. If you as a Westerner, you criticize aspects of Chineseness, you won't get a nationalistic reaction. You will get a jingoistic reaction. Back to the book. By far the most nationalistic country of the 7 I have lived in was the US. I remember attending my first graduation ceremony at my US university as a professor there. 2 flag-carrying students in soldiers' uniform marched in, and the whole crowd of tens of thousands of Americans stood up like clockwork. Like clockwork. I was shocked. Several years later, while at a classical music concert in the US, the orchestra struck up the US national anthem. Oh no, I thought, and groaned. Everyone in the whole concert hall stood up except me. I was amazed to see the conductor glaring at me in uncomprehending scorn. I felt the impulse to perform my first public globist act and give him a globist slogan, but simply kept quiet and gave him my petit con American look instead. I will mention this incident again in a slightly different context in Chapter 9, Section B. I remember decades ago as a teenager in Australia that a movie theatre would play the Australian national anthem, God Save the Queen. I stopped standing after a few years. I guess a lot of other people did the same because the custom died out several years before I left the country in 1971. Years later, during my first trips to the US as a grad student, I learned that the word patriot had positive connotations in the US. In Europe, the word has distinctly negative connotations, for example, of bigotry, blindness, ignorance, etc. The Europeans were more nationalistic a century ago, but the horrors of trench warfare in World War I and the mechanized killing of World War II taught the Europeans to integrate their nations into the EU and to downplay nationalisms. The US, on the other hand, has never had a major war in its territory, unless you count as major the US Civil War that occurred a century and a half ago in a handful of US states that killed only about 500,000 people. Or if you can call a war the American Holocaust of the 90 million Native Americans that the European settlers killed off as they moved west. Question mark. Was it really 90? That seems so much. The US is so large that it's difficult for Americans to leave the country. They have to fly for hours to reach Europe. It's much easier for continental Europeans to travel internationally than it is for Americans. European countries, with their different languages and cultures, are the size of states in the US. If you drive for a few hours in the US, you will arrive in another state with the same main street, chain stores as anywhere else in the country. It's not surprising that Americans are such monos. They have maintained their 19th century nationalism that the Europeans have been bayoneted out of them in 2 horrible world wars. The level of nationalism in the US is such that I would not be surprised that many Globa will not form around the US or NAFTA or FTAA, but around the European Union, EU. Of course, the US will play a major role in the creation of the global media because the US is the world leader in technology and is likely to maintain that role for some decades at least to come. To overcome the blindness and ignorance of nationalism, the global media will play an essential role. People of many countries will be able to see for themselves the pros and cons of other countries. With a hyper-fast internet and real-world quality 3D images, billions of people will be able to travel in their living rooms to whichever tourist site they want on the planet. The Globus should promote the technological development of the Glow Media project. As emphasized frequently in this book, it's probably the single most important thing that they can do to promote the creation of Globa. A global media will be so attractive that it will sell itself. Everyone will want to have access to it. Look at the rapid increase of the use of the internet in China. At the time of writing, there are more Chinese using the internet than Americans. At the time of writing, that was 2007, there were 220 million Americans using the internet. That is 72% of the population, compared with 250 million Chinese, that is 19% of the population. Soon, there will be hugely more Chinese internet users than Americans, similarly with India, but at a slower pace. Ad-libbing. I think 800 million Chinese now, in 2017, have access to, have cell phones, I think, and about 500 million, I need to Google this, it's been a while, and some 500 million Chinese have smartphones, so internet accessible cell phones. Okay, back to the book. Is there much that Globus can do before the enabling technologies are able to create a 3D hyper-fast internet, which will take another 30 years? Probably not a lot. There will be incremental changes to many forces pushing for the creation of a global state. What can be done, however, in the interim is to develop globism as an ideology. More people like myself can write books, get on the media to promote and familiarize populations with the concept, saying such things as, globism is coming, globism is inevitable, our global history is heading towards it, the size of the political unit keeps increasing, soon it will be the size of the planet, etc. When billions of people become familiar with the concept of a global state, there will be less resistance to its creation, so long as it is not pushed onto them too quickly. So the Globus can blaze the trail that will later become a highway that will be built by the global media and then a global language, etc. Once people begin to see vivid images of other countries and learn the global language, that is English, they will be able to hear the views and ideas of other cultures. They will be able to make comparisons between what their own leaders say and what other countries' leaders say. They will begin to become multis. They will learn a sense of cultural relativity. They will see with their own eyes and hear with their own ears the superiorities of other cultures, and that will decrease the strength of their own nationalisms. They will lose their chauvinistic blindness. They will be able to take a more multicultured view of the world and will begin to rank cultures in terms of their own more multicultured experiences. If they consider their own culture to be inferior to other cultures in certain respects, they'll be able to absorb the superiorities of those other cultures into their own personalities and thus benefit from their greater sophistication. They will then learn that their former nationalism was a kind of blind ignorance, an emotional illusion. They will become more sympathetic to the slogan of the multis, that nationalism is the privilege of the monocultured, and appreciate its irony. In short, I see the Glow Media project killing off nationalism. It will multiply billions of minds and educate them out of their nationalistic myopia. D. National sovereignty. A Glow Media project may multiply the minds of billions of ordinary citizens, but what about the minds of their leaders? Will they be willing to sacrifice some of their sovereignty to form closer political unions with other countries or blocs? Fortunately, this idea is not mere theory. It's already happening with the EU. Various national leaders of the EU countries are increasingly, step by step, giving up small portions of their sovereignty to the larger EU institutions. EU law now has greater force or precedence than national law in many cases, so it can be done. When the US unified its independent colonial states 2 centuries ago to form the United States of America, the state leaders had to forego their former state sovereignty. They chose to, and did, after much debate. So in a manner of speaking, one can say that America is 200 years ahead of the EU in forming a continental-size political union. Of course, forming a USA was much easier than forming a USE, that is, the United States of Europe, because the US states were already culturally homogeneous. The US settlers were mostly English colonists, speaking English, with English laws, religions, customs, values, etc. The level of distrust between the American states was far less at the time than between England and France, for example. In the rich democracies, actually all the rich democracies of the world are democracies, all the rich countries of the world are democracies. The populations of these countries are in a position to push their political leaders to merge more closely with other countries if the population so choose. Public opinion will motivate the politicians to do what the public wants. If a critical mass of the population opts for merging into ever larger economic and political blocs, the leaders will oblige and make it happen. The poorer dictatorial countries will probably be a lot slower in joining this process. They will probably have to go through the whole get-rich phase and then convert to democracy before the leadership allows in the global media needed to culturally homogenize their peoples. However, one should not underestimate the influence that social pressure coming from the leaders of the advanced nations can exert on the leaders of the poorer, undemocratic nations in international fora. For example, I was an invitee, a scientific fellow, at the 1998 Davos World Economic Forum, WEF, and saw with my own eyes how much pressure the underdeveloped countries' leaders were placed under at the hands of the leaders of the top countries. You could sense the shame and the annoyance they felt concerning their nation's backwardness, and hear the implicit criticisms they received from the leaders of the more advanced nations. If the majority of advanced nations merge into a mini Globa, pressure on the poorer, less developed nations to do the same will increase. This pressure will come from both the mini Globa itself, due to its very existence, and from the populations of the poorer countries themselves. E. Cultural differences. How could one ever get two cultures as different as China and America to merge economically and politically to form a global state? Aren't the cultural differences just too great, unbridgeable? The Chinese see the US as a hegemonic bully, throwing its military weight around as it wants, for example, as in Iraq. And the US sees China as morally inferior because it is still a dictatorship and still honours Mao Zedong, whom Western countries consider to be history's greatest mass-murdering tyrant. in brackets, Mao is reported to have killed about 70 million Chinese, according to biographies of him written by Chinese expatriates living in democratic Western countries. Of course, these books are banned in China, so most Chinese are unaware of Mao's massive crimes. Close brackets. The American people detest the Chinese government, and the Chinese people see the American government as arrogant and dangerous. How on earth could these two cultures change so that they become culturally homogeneous? A tall order, is it not? Question mark. What about the Arab nations and the US? The Arab nations see the US as Zionist, that is, that the Jews should have their own country and that it should be located in Palestine. The Arab nations see the US as supporting the Israelis and their colonization of Palestinian lands. As already discussed to some extent in chapters 2 and 3, this has been one of the long-term injustices of the 20th century and is a festering sore that now has come home to roost with the rise of Arab terrorism, that is, revenge on US soil. That is 9/11. I don't believe that. 9/11 was a false flag, an inside job committed largely by the Jewish elite and Mossad, Israeli Secret Service, equivalent to America's CIA, etc., etc. So, don't be fooled, people. The Arab countries see the US as criminally unjust and contemptible, and the US sees the Arab countries as medieval, backward, and contemptible. How could these two very different cultures come together? To bring these pairs of cultures closer together, a global media is essential. I deal with both of the above cases to illustrate my point. For Americans to respect Chinese, or rather Chinese government, the Chinese government needs to become democratic. The fact that a country as economically important as China finds itself in the bottom third of countries of the world that are still not democratic makes China look third world in Americans' eyes, that is, as unworthy of respect, even contemptible. For Chinese to respect America, America will need to learn to be more sensitive to other cultures and become a lot more interculturally competent, losing its bad reputation of being monolingual, monocultured, and gullible. Then America would be a lot less arrogant and brutish with its military might. If the US keeps its present mentality, then the Chinese feel they must teach the US a lesson by pushing it off its pedestal as the world's dominant power. The huge potential of China, with its 1.3 billion people and its average growth rate of about 10% a year, compared with America's 0.3 billion people and 3% economic growth rate, means that sooner or later China will be able to steamroller over the US and squash it like an ant if it chooses to. Instead of the world's two economic superpowers, America and China, going at each other's throats, it would be a lot smarter for both if they educated themselves via the world media and change themselves into more civilized cultures, with both learning from the insights of the other cultures. China is not the only culture who sees the US as arrogant and dangerous. Europe also wants to push the US off its pedestal. Both China and Europe are big enough to do it. What is so worrying is that the US is by far the world's dominant military superpower and may not take kindly to being brought down a peg or three. At the time of writing, that's 2007, the US spends about $350 billion a year on defence compared to Europe's $175 billion. That's literally a half of America's. And China's $50 billion. From the European perspective, the US desperately needs to be multified. The US is far more insular-minded and less interculturally sophisticated than Europe. Now, what about the US and the Arabs? I remember being shocked at the extreme insularity shown by the mayor of New York immediately after 9/11, my first working day in the US, I might add. In his reaction to a sympathetic Arab leader who offered to donate a large sum of money to the victims of the 9/11 attacks, the Arab leader amiably suggested to the New York mayor that the US should be more mindful of its support of Israel and hence its support of the suppression of the rights of the Palestinians by the Israelis, and the US's role in motivating the attack. The New York mayor became angry and refused to take the money. This kind of monocultured ignorance and blindness truly shocked me. There are probably millions of Americans who agreed with the feelings of the New York mayor. So how to close the perception gap between the Americans and the Arabs? Imagine what will happen when the Americans have global television and that several 100,000 American intellectuals are able to watch Arab television dubbed into good English. What will happen? What will happen to the minds of